It feels weird to be back. It feels a little bit strange. I have had the last 4 Sundays off from preaching. The first 2 Sundays, I was out of the country on a 13-day trip that mimicked basically the missionary journeys of Paul in Italy, in Greece, and in Turkey. And then the last 2 Sundays, Barb and I did a couple of quick weekend trips. And so it felt strange my last Sunday here a month ago when I left, and it feels a little strange coming back, but it's nice to be back. And I am glad to be back. So I've got a lot to say. I've got 4 weeks of sermons to make up, so sit back, relax. We'll try to get you out before the noon service starts later today. Major League Baseball player Pete Rose died on September 30th, and while he played from 1963 to 1986, most prominently he was a member of the Cincinnati Reds lineup known as the Big Red Machine for their dominance of the National League back in the 1970s. In the height of his career, he seemed larger than life, especially to little boys who loved baseball during that time. That was the era I know when I grew up. But his career highlights were overshadowed by an indiscretion when he was penalized with permanent ineligibility from baseball amid accusations that he gambled on baseball games while he played for and he managed the Reds. In 1991, the Baseball Hall of Fame formally voted to ban those on the permanently ineligible list from induction. Now, even today, there are two camps regarding Rose's potential induction into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Those who believe he should not be inducted, and those who believe even posthumously he should be. Well, Moses had been allowed to see the Promised Land, but he was not permitted to enter into it. His character flaw of anger kept him from that privilege, and he had some indiscretions that prevented him from grasping that prize of entering the Promised Land. When he initially received the 10 Commandments, Moses was descending Mount Sinai, and he saw the Israelites worshiping around a golden calf, and he became enraged, and he threw down the tablets, shattering them. Before the Israelites were freed from slavery, Moses witnessed an Egyptian taskmaster beating a slave, and Moses murdered that taskmaster, burying him in the sand. Throughout the whole Exodus narrative, Moses often grew frustrated with the continual complaining and the doubting of the Israelites, and that often resulted in his having outbursts of anger. As Moses was leading the people of God towards the Promised Land, there was an instance where he was told by God to speak to the rock and water would come forth, but instead he struck the rock in great frustration. And that specific act went beyond God's limit of patience, and he banned Moses from entering the Promised Land due to his lack of faith. So a series of indiscretions kept Moses from being rewarded with the opportunity to step into the Promised Land with the Israelites. Moses was 120 years old at the end of his life, and he climbed Mount Nebo where he died and where God would bury him in an unmarked grave. I believe that occurred so that people would not want to make a shrine of some kind to Moses and his leadership. It was now a time for change in leadership. The appropriate 30 days of mourning was permitted to occur within the Israelite camp, and then Joshua became the new leader. And it'd be Joshua who would lead God's people into the Promised Land. Last week, Matt Hayden preached the opening sermon of this series entitled, "Courage is Commanded for God's People. They followed his commands to step into the boundaries of the Promised Land." The series we're going through right now is entitled Joshua Leading into the Promise. And today's message is Maintain the Unity. Earlier this year, you may recall, we went through a capital campaign called The Promise, based on Acts 2:39, as we look towards a new children's wing being constructed beginning next year. And in Joshua, as God's people were about to inhabit their land of promise, we're going to see several principles from the book of Joshua that rise to the surface that were implemented. And those same principles are applicable to our church as well. Now, there was a lot to process for the Israelites. Their leader, Moses, of 40 years, was now gone. He had been like a mountain landscape before them for those 4 decades, and for those 2 to 3 million people involved, taking steps of faith into the promised land would be difficult without him. But there were still problems that needed to be addressed once they occupied the land. And God's promises are often conditional, and they're often contingent upon our faith. And now comes Joshua, this young military leader that's going to help God's people maintain their unity as they move forward. Because it's imperative that we as a church maintain the unity of our people as we move forward into this building project called the Promise. Now, I don't want you to get nervous. It's not a sermon series about giving to the capital campaign. We've already done all of that. This is a sermon series about practical attitudes and actions that we need to take to stay focused as we go through a building project. I want you to turn to Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter 1, or pull that up on your phone, and we're going to begin reading with verse 10. We're going to read verses 10 through 18. So Joshua ordered the officers of the people, "Go through the camp and tell the people, get your provisions ready. 3 days from now, you'll cross the Jordan here to go in and take possession of the land the Lord your God is giving you for your own." But to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, Joshua said, "Remember the command that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you after he said, 'The Lord your God will give you rest by giving you this land.' Your wives, your children, and your livestock may stay in the land that Moses gave you east of the Jordan. But all your fighting men ready for battle must cross over ahead of your fellow Israelites. You are to help them until the Lord gives them rest, as he's done for you, and until they too have taken possession of the land the Lord your God is giving them. After that, you may go back and occupy your own land, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you east of the Jordan toward the sunrise." Then they answered, "Joshua, whatever you've commanded us we'll do, and wherever you send us we'll go. Just as we fully obeyed Moses, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. Whoever rebels against your word and does not obey it, whatever you may command them, will be put to death. Only be strong and courageous." So in this passage, I want to see several things about how do you maintain unity of a collective group of people as you go through changes moving forward. One of those is to remember the purpose. The purpose of God reminding his people to be strong and courageous was because they were preparing to fight some battles to overtake the promised land. God had promised it, but now he was going to deliver them there, but they needed a continual faith to keep taking the necessary steps. Now, here in a month, we celebrate Thanksgiving. For more than 2 months, the Pilgrims sailed 3,000 miles of open ocean with 102 passengers on the Mayflower. And they were squeezed below decks in crowded, cold, and damp conditions. They suffered crippling bouts of sickness. They survived on meager rations. The smell and the stench of illness and sickness down below and the freezing cold on the deck in the elements would have made that journey miserable. But they survived, and they arrived in this new world. What is interesting is there is a little story that happened 1 year later when it was suggested that these pilgrims build a road only 1 mile further into the wilderness. And many of those initial pilgrims protested because of the potential danger to go another 5,280 feet. This coming from a group who had traveled over 3,000 miles 1 year earlier, not knowing what they were going to find. And for 40 years, the Israelites had wandered in the wilderness, and now they're about to settle into a new era of living and occupying land that God had promised them. Now, getting there wasn't always easy. Their purpose of occupying the land was attempted to be thwarted several times. You remember the story when the spies were sent into the land to inspect it? 12 spies had gone into the land of Canaan to determine the military strategy that was needed to conquer the promised land. 10 of them were intimidated by the project, believing the inhabitants were too well fortified to be uprooted. The majority of the spies gave their report, and thousands of God's people began trembling in fear. But then 2 of the spies quieted the people and begged to differ with their peers. They suggested, by all means, we've got to go up and we take possession of the land, for we shall surely overcome it. Now, it's easy during a project that requires faith and effort and unity and finances that some people get what's called the grasshopper complex. Those 10 negative spies saw only the Canaanites as these large giants, and they went back and reported to the people, we feel like we're just grasshoppers, we're going to be smashed by these giants. But those 2 spies, though, who motivated the people to keep moving forward was an 80-year-old man named Caleb and then Joshua. And they helped to bring and maintain the unity of God's people because they believed God's promise of the land, and they knew his purpose had to prevail. So as we go through this building project, I want to remind us all of our purpose. It's not just to expand our facilities and to increase square footage. Our purpose statement is we exist to connect all people to Jesus and one another. So we should always be unapologetic for anything we can do to increase the population of the kingdom of God and to decrease the population of hell. In this calendar year, we've already had over 80 baptisms into Christ. You have been praying and inviting and sharing and loving and giving and articulating the purpose of the church in both words and deeds. I am so proud of you as a congregation, but I am so humbled to be a part of what God is doing here. And our leaders know that investing into the lives of our children help to prepare the next generation of Christians and of church leaders. When any group knows its purpose, it always helps to maintain the unity. As part of my sabbatical, I took a 13-day trip covering some of the missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul. It was a great trip. I was in Italy, I was in Turkey, I was in Greece. 9 days of the trip was aboard the Odyssey of the Seas ship, a ship operated by Royal Caribbean. Somebody has to suffer for Jesus. And of those 9 days, there were 6 of them where we had excursions to visit various places, most of those associated with the ministry of the Apostle Paul. Now, a typical excursion day was up at 5 a.m., breakfast at 6 a.m., a disembarkment meeting at 7 a.m., on a bus by 7:30, and then traveling to places like Corinth and Athens and Ephesus and Crete. The evenings on the ship were a little bit more relaxing. There were 188 total in our big overall group that was together. And the ship, the Odyssey of the Seas, has a capacity of 5,500 passengers and almost 2,000 crew. So there's about 7,700 people on this ship. And since the evenings were usually free, I would often relax and read, sometimes walk around the various decks. But one evening I was walking, and I saw a gentleman in a dress uniform and realized he was obviously part of the ship's crew. So I approached him and I asked him what his role was on the ship. And he told me that he was the chief operations officer for the engine crew. And he said, my role is chief operations officer for the engine crew, but he said, my purpose is to provide you a relaxing and pleasurable cruise and make sure the engines and the sailing of the ship run smoothly. And he told me in that conversation, he said, I have about 80 people under my command. The next evening at dinner, I asked our head waiter, whose name was Geed and Tara. I've got a picture of me and Geed there together. He's a 26-year-old from Indonesia. I asked Geed, I said, what is your role? He said, my role is that of a head waiter in the main dining room, but he said, my purpose is to provide you a relaxing and pleasurable cruise and provide the best service possible with your meals. And he did. For 9 straight evenings, this young man was my waiter. Every evening, I would sit down, and within seconds, he would be there unfolding the napkin on the table and placing it on my lap. You know, my first evening back home, I went to the dining room table, sat down and waited. And I waited. And I waited. If I hadn't got up, I'd still be sitting there waiting right now. No one showed up with a napkin for my lap. No one even showed up with dinner for a while. Later that evening, I met Alvin, who was from the Philippines. Alvin was a 32-year-old who was in the cleaning department, and it was his job to take in the towels from the pool. If you didn't return your pool towel each day, there was a $25 charge added to your bill. And Alvin worked on the ship from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. His first 2 hours, he said, was spent collecting and accounting for the pool towels and then washing thousands of pool towels. But from midnight until 8 o'clock, it was his job to drain and clean all the whirlpools on board, then to chemically treat the pools on board, and then to scrub the decks around the pool. When I asked him what his role was, he said, I work in the cleaning crew. He said, but I do it for the purpose of providing you a relaxing and pleasurable cruise by keeping my areas spotless. That's a third consecutive time I had heard that. So I asked Alvin, I said, had the crew been trained to say that? Obviously they had. And he shared with me how he had worked on some other ships in the same cruise line, but that the management was not as good and the captains were not as good. And he said, my manager and our captain meet with our crew at the beginning of each cruise, and they remind us that our purpose is to provide each passenger a relaxing and pleasurable cruise on this ship, no matter what our roles might be. And so can I remind each of us, no matter what our roles might be, whether you're on paid staff or whether you volunteer, those roles are going to vary. But we exist to connect all people to Jesus and one another. And Joshua reminded the people, the Lord your God is giving you this land. So I want us to remember our purpose so we can maintain the unity of the church as we move forward. Then also, I want you to recognize the problems that can occur. Even when God's people are grouping together with a reminded purpose, problems can occur. You know why? We are human in nature. We deal with that dilemma daily. The unity of God's people can be threatened when there's a huge undertaking, and Joshua recognized that as a leader, he would have to deal with those threats and not ignore them. And just a few days into his leading of God's people, he's confronted with an issue, and that was what to do with the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. They had asked Moses years earlier if they could stay on the east side of the Jordan because the land on the east side of the Jordan was more suitable for their livestock. But Moses initially was suspicious of their motives, and he was alert to the discouraging impact they could have on the other tribes if these 2.5 tribes were allowed to stay in that region while all the other tribes are moving across the river and they're fighting for the promised land. So Moses agreed they could do that with one caveat, that the men from those 2.5 tribes would fight along with the others in conquering the land, and then when successful, they could return to their wives and their children and the animals on the east side of the Jordan. And Joshua could have easily overturned that decision by his predecessor, but he maintains the decision so as to maintain the unity of the people. And throughout the whole process of getting God's people to the promised land, there were several issues that occurred that could have unraveled the thread of unity that God desired. One of them was doubting hearts can threaten unity. Earlier, the people, as they followed Moses, and you may remember they were trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army, they said to Moses, it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And when problems arise that threaten God's people, it's easy to focus on the negativity rather than the purpose and the scope of what God desires. So I want to encourage you as a congregation, don't allow negativity to prevail in our upcoming project. There's going to be challenges. There's going to be inconveniences. There's going to be a muddy mess when digging starts. There's going to be time the project may get delayed, weather, late arrival of materials, scheduling of subcontractors. When we built this sanctuary and occupied it in 1997, we ran into some problems. About 35% into the project, the contractor went into bankruptcy, and we had to close the project down. It sat idle for over 6 months. The first phase of this building project was to cost around $800,000. We were planning to borrow $400,000, and we were going to have money put back in the bank for payments for the first 2 years of the loan. But when we moved in because of the bankruptcy and restarting the project, the cost landed around $1.1 million. We ended up having to borrow $600,000. We had no extra cash on hand. I remember the treasurer came to me the very first Sunday we were in this building. It was a great Sunday. The place was packed out, and the treasurer came over to me and she said, hold your paycheck until the offerings are deposited. Your check may bounce. That wasn't fun. It didn't bounce. And we announced to the congregation the situation. They rose to the task. We never looked back. Scott Hayes, a lifetime member here and one of our current elders, shared, I think the purchase of our current site and the leaving behind of our old church building at the northeast corner of Broad in York was quite challenging, as it represented significant risk and substantial change. Our primary contractor's bankruptcy during construction of the initial phase of our current worship center was even more so. But as often the case with unexpected difficulties, God taught us valuable and enduring lessons in patience and faith. The picture in my mind of the partially pieced together steel structure sitting idle during the winter with snow blowing through what would eventually become the sanctuary space is indelible. However, that which was frightening in the moment has now become an encouraging reminder of the faithfulness of our God. Doubting hearts can threaten unity. A distorted image can threaten unity. Remember earlier I mentioned the 10 negative spies that saw the people, and they saw the people in Canaan, and they thought of themselves as grasshoppers compared to these giants of Canaan. The reality is the Canaanites saw themselves as grasshoppers and the Israelites as the giants, because in chapter 2 of Joshua, when the spies make an expedition into the promised land, they go to Jericho, they make contact with Rahab the prostitute, and she knew the sentiment of the town towards the Israelites, and she reports in Joshua 2, 8, and 9, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord your God has given you this land, and that a great fear has fallen us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. Here the Israelites thought they were the ones who were fearful, and yet it was the Canaanites who were fearful of them. Now, one of the great pieces of news we've had in preparing for this project is that our general contractor, Visionaring Studios, has had a positive response from many of our subcontractors who worked on our last project. When we completed the cafe, chapel, and children's worship area in 2017, those who were involved with that, many of them are coming back to be involved in this project. Now, I know I, for one, had concerns that this project might be too small for some subcontractors and it might be too large for others, and that getting participation, getting bids might become difficult because, as you know, there's this huge construction boom occurring in our area. But God's timing, God's purposes are always best. Another potential problem that can threaten unity is the desire for security. Matt Hayden touched on this last week when he spoke about fear. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite the fear. Anytime there's change, there's a certain level of fear and there's a certain level of anxiety. It'd be easier for us as a church to remain comfortable with our facilities, our attendance, our current giving patterns, go along with the various ministries as we are. But the Israelites were preparing to accept the challenge of new battles by entering the promised land. Now, if they refused to enter, they would not need to cope with the fear of failure. You remember when Peter walked on water briefly? Do you remember when he was walking out to Jesus and he began to sink as he headed towards the Lord? And we chide Peter a little bit for taking his eyes off Christ, but we ought to commend him for at least being willing to take that risk of hopping out of the boat and his trying to walk on the water. And though he wavered in the process, he took the risk of trusting Jesus for a miracle. The other disciples were not in danger of drowning. They played it safe. They stayed in the boat. Security is always easier than risk. I have to be honest, one of my weaknesses of my own faith is sometimes a preference of security over failure. I'd be more comfortable if we had all the cash on hand to build the project with borrowing. I'd be more comfortable that every T was already crossed and every I dotted by now instead of going through tons of hours of Zoom meetings about the project. Last Sunday evening, you all did a great job with trunk or treat on the property here, and nearly 1,000 people attended. And for several years, it's been our largest outreach here on the property. But guess what? Next year, when we have trunk or treat, all the property on the west side of the building is going to be involved in the upcoming project. All that land that we use this year for trunk or treat's not going to be available. We're going to have to be juggling spacing and making adjustments and doing logistical maneuvering. And it might require some good creativity as we see how we can keep moving forward in faith. So Joshua was not aloof to the potential problems that could occur as God's people prepared to enter the promised land. Now here's one other attitude that we ought to keep during the upcoming project when it gets started. That is, simply recall the power of unity. The ancient Greeks, I'd heard this before and I heard it again when I was over in Greece. They had a race in which a man would stand with one foot on one horse and the other foot on another horse. And the man was able to ride in that fashion, guess what? As long as the horses stayed together. But when they began to separate, he had a decision he had to make. One of Joshua's first challenges was to make a decision regarding the request of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and that half-tribe of Manasseh to stay on the east side of the Jordan. Can you imagine Joshua hearing all the questions and the ideas of trying to do that? You know what it was like for Joshua? He's herding cats. All right? Joshua had 2 to 3 million people initially who were listening to him. Some people say that's the number, of course, that started with Moses, and then maybe it dwindled a little bit over time and decreased with an aging population. But even the most conservative Bible scholars say that Joshua had at least 600,000 people that he's trying to get to enter into the promised land. That is a huge number of people to try to be leading. My trip to Italy, Greece, and Turkey was an organized tour group of 188 people. And we were divided into 5 groups of almost 40 each. You kept your same group the whole time. The group stayed together on the same bus. We did the same tours together. But I'm going to tell you, it was like herding cats. The day we visited the Colosseum in Rome, one of our group members got separated from us. And he's a good friend of mine. We got to the Roma Coliseum. They told us, they said, there are about 30,000 people here today visiting. And it was just wall-to-wall people for blocks, lines everywhere around the Coliseum. And our group got our permission to head in as our group, and they scan you for security and for your passports and all that. We're getting ready to go towards the Coliseum, and we just got inside the fenced area around it, and my phone rings. First thing I'm thinking, that's going to cost me $10. This is the Verizon International Day Plan. Who is calling me while I'm over here in Italy? And I look, and it's one of our tour guides. And I thought, why is Claudia calling me? Hello, Claudia, you're only 50 feet behind me. You could have just yelled at me, saved me $10. And she said, we've lost Bill. Can you find Bill? Do you know where he is? And we couldn't find him. He was in our group. We couldn't find him. Nobody saw him. As we had entered in, he just made one step like to the left, got in with another group who headed the opposite direction. And he wasn't even in the same group of tour groups that our group was in. And it took us over an hour to find him. Can you imagine how hard Joshua had to work to attempt to keep hundreds of thousands of people together? Not only logistically, but in attitude and in heart. How did he do that? How did he keep the power of unity? I ran across a little book entitled Lead Like Joshua, written by Derek Tidball. And he suggests that Joshua made decisions in this matter that helped maintain the unity of God's people. He said Joshua made a decision that was clear. In verse 13, we're told that Joshua recognized what Moses has said to the people, and the 2.5 tribes that wanted to stay on the east side of the Jordan could not shelter in the background. They could not sneak home before the task was finished. Only after they'd gone and fought could they occupy their requested territory. There were no loopholes. The decision was clear. And when leaders are dealing with decisions that affect a lot of people, it can be easy to be ambiguous just to get people supporting the effort, but in the long run, that can be harmful. Late preacher Wayne B. Smith of Lexington, Kentucky used to say, if you wait until all the lights are green before you drive downtown, you'll never get there. And there comes a time when decisions have to be made, that have to be communicated clearly. And Joshua made a decision that was wise. Later on, the nation of Israel was going to split. When Rehoboam succeeded Solomon as king of all Israel, he foolishly rejected the advice of his elders, and he sought to lay an unbearably heavy burden on his people, a burden of taxes. And it caused a lot of the tribes to break away from him, and the kingdom got split in two. Foolish decisions can have catastrophic effects and take years to repair if they can be repaired at all. But Joshua, thankfully, was the exact opposite of Rehoboam. Joshua made a very wise decision in honoring the previous agreement Moses had made with those 2 1/2 tribes, because Joshua was a person of integrity. And if Joshua would have alienated those people in the tribes before they occupied the promised land, it could have easily have split the nation. The other tribes would have mistrust in his leadership. And then Joshua made a decision that was respectful. He allowed the children and he allowed the wives of the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh to remain in that eastern land while the fathers and the husbands are going to fight. There's no point in uprooting them, putting them through the hardships of trudging through the battlefields of Canaan. They're already paying a hefty price in being separated. J. Oswald Sanders, in his book Spiritual Leadership, cites this example of Joshua as being an exemplary leader in tact and diplomacy. He writes, "It involves the ability to place oneself in the position of the persons involved and so accurately assess how they would feel and react." So as a church, let's remember the power of unity, of working together for a common cause in Christ. Now, because of the grumbling of many of the Israelites under Moses, do you remember early on, God punished them for their lack of faith and disobedience by not allowing the generation that began this journey 40 years earlier to live to see the promised land? It's going to be the next generation, led by Joshua and Caleb, that are going to be the ones permitted to enter Canaan. I got to thinking this past week, and I thought of many of our members who were here when we relocated to this property in 1997, and how many of those have left this world to their eternal reward, and how the generations have changed. I'm going to list just a handful of names here. Some of you will remember these names. Some of you may not know them. That's okay. I think of people like Dutch and Jean Potts, Charlie and Jenny Waybright, Ralph and Loretta Barnett, Ron and Paula Eddy, Bill and June Herderick, Don Hutchison, Larry and Kathy Johnson, Jay Dalgarn, Bill and Norma Paxson, and a lot of others. They were committed to the Lord. They were committed to this church. They were committed to keep moving forward in faith as this church grew. But that generation is mostly gone now. And a new generation is here to help us keep moving towards a promise of hope and life in Jesus Christ. Well, several have asked about my sabbatical and my trip and what my favorite part was, or my favorite place to visit. My very favorite place to visit, and you'll hear more about it later in sermons. I've only got about 3,000 pictures. It's okay. I'll show you all of those next week. My favorite place to visit was Ephesus, where I could envision the Apostle Paul preaching and getting arrested and then being hauled off to Rome from there. And my second favorite place was the Roman Colosseum. Just its rich history, especially regarding the first century Christians. But this past week, somebody asked me a question I hadn't been asked before, and they said, "What was the most difficult part of the trip for you?" And it wasn't anything that actually occurred on the trip, or it wasn't any of the places I visited. It was when I received word that one of our longtime members had passed away. A member, one of the few now, who's actually been here longer than me. And the day before my sabbatical started, Bev Danoon had heart bypass surgery. And I went to see her after her surgery was over, and she was slowly waking up. It was on Tuesday afternoon, and I stayed there a couple of hours with her as she was waking up. And the nurse kept telling me and kept telling Bev's daughters to keep talking to her and say, "Tell her to open her eyes. Tell her to squeeze your hands." So they're doing that, and one of the daughters had to leave to run home to do something, and me and the other daughter were still there. And she said, "Go over and talk to Mom." And so I went over, and I grabbed Bev's hands, and her eyes were starting to open up. And I leaned down up right against close to her ear, and I said, "Bev, it's your favorite preacher." I said, "Open your eyes and look at me." I swear she opened her eyes and rolled them at me right about that time. But I prayed with her, and I stayed a bit longer, and I asked her to squeeze my hand several times, and she did. And the other daughter got back, and I told her daughters, I said, your mom's going to bounce back like she always has. But she didn't. Her weakening body just could not withstand the trauma and the issues of the heart. And I got a text from my wife on Saturday, October the 5th, that Bev wasn't expected to live through the day. And due to the 7-hour time difference and my being on a ship and not having internet, texts were slow. And while the time stamp on the 2 texts Barb sent me were actually hours apart, I received them just minutes apart, the second one coming just a couple of minutes after the first one. And the first one said, "Bev's not expected to live through the day." And then just a few minutes later, I got the text on my phone that said Bev had already passed away. And my heart just broke. I had been her preacher for nearly 35 years. I had performed her mom's funeral back in the 90s, Elsie Galloway. I officiated her husband's funeral a couple years ago. And when I received the text about Bev's death, I was in my cabin getting ready for dinner. And I just stopped. And I just started sobbing. And I fell to my knees there at the bedside. And I just prayed and thanked God for her long life and for her faithfulness of many years to the Lord and to this church. And I thought of how so many in her generation in this church have been so faithful to the Lord. When times got tough, they could have walked away. When things changed, as the church grew, and they didn't like some of them, they could have quit. But they remained faithful. What about your generation? What about my generation? Are we being faithful? Are we doing what we can to maintain the unity of God's people in this place? Just as Moses neared his own death, he penned Psalm 90. It's become one of my favorite psalms. And it says in Psalm 90, verses 1 and 2, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Moses had died, and Joshua was leading a new generation into a new land and into new opportunities. God will keep leading our church into new opportunities as we strive to maintain the unity of his people in this place. If you need to make a decision for Christ, you need to make a decision for membership. When we dismiss after our time of worship and communion, you can meet with me up here in the front near the baptistry. Let's pray together. Father, remind us of one thing today for each generation represented here, that we be faithful. No matter the circumstances that we may endure as individual Christians, no matter the circumstances we go through together as a church, may we simply remain faithful. Remain faithful to you, to the God who is over all generations. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.